It's myself, underpinnings. Then we have Tess Davis and Amy Rodgers, who are going to talk about behavior change to us today. If you would like to introduce yourselves in the chat, you are very welcome to do so. Unfortunately, we won't have much time to do that to each other in person. Online, but we could do that in the chat. Tess Davis, as you can see here, is a social psychologist. She also researches climate from the University of Strathclyde. And Amy Rodgers is a research fellow from the University of Edinburgh. They will tell us today, I think, about an important topic, that is behavioral change, and how to go about it. And from the many people that subscribe to this talk, it's quite clear that this isn't something that a lot of people are interested in, I think. And so we are really happy that so many of you have decided to join us.
So I'm going to kick us off today. I'm Amy, and today we're going to look at changing consumers' dietary behaviours and why it's not often as straightforward as we might think it is at first. And if we can go to the next slide, we're going to talk through kind of 4 key questions as we talk a little bit about the complexity in this space when we consider what is eating behaviour, what drives it, what strategies might we use to change it, and then finally, based on all of that, think a little bit about maybe what you can do with all of the information that we're going to be covering today. So let's start with this first question of what is eating behaviour. Now, much of today's framing on complexity of behaviour actually comes from my PhD research, and this focused actually on water drinking. The key conclusion was that drinking water is actually far more complex than we as researchers or health practitioners or even policymakers sometimes think of it. And I do think the same applies to eating behaviour. And so to bring this idea of what I mean by complexity to life, I'm going to introduce Dave, who me and Tess are going to allude to quite a bit through this presentation. Dave is a father. He works full-time in an office job Monday to Friday, and he has a partner. And the first thing I want to think of is what we mean by eating or dietary behaviour when we think of Dave. So if we go to the next slide, as researchers, practitioners, policymakers, we often tend to think of the actual act of eating. And we can see this, and this is what we typically measure. It's through food diaries, 24-hour recall, other forms of self-report, asking people what they eat across the day. And we usually do this to assess in some form, is their diet healthy? Maybe is their diet sustainable? And it was the same in my water drinking research, right? We were primarily interested in intake, how much someone drank throughout the day. But when we think about eating behaviours like Dave's eating, there are actually many behaviours that we should be considering across many contexts. And so these behaviours, they actually occur prior to the act of eating, and they really influence the shape that eating will take. And this concerns mainly a lot of behaviours that we can lump under the title of preparation. So in my water drinking research, we were asking, do people have a bottle of water? Do they prepare this? Do they carry it around with them? Do they have a glass of fluid or liquid that they can drink around their desk at work? These types of questions. And for Dave, a father who works full time, and if we think back to him in the supermarket with his son, he's buying food, he's maybe had conversations with his partner about what meals they're going to make that week. Maybe they've even made a list. Maybe they batch prep cook at the weekends. Maybe they cook daily. He might grab something on his commute, stopping at a cafe or Boots for a meal deal. Maybe he uses his work canteen. And in some of these situations, he's not prepping the food, but he's making decisions about what food to choose that's already pre-prepared. The point is that when we talk about dietary behaviour, eating behaviour, there's a whole host of behaviours that happen before eating, and they're crucial to think about when determining what someone ends up consuming. And like I said, they happen across many contexts. We're not talking about behaviour in the abstract, we're talking about behaviour in people's daily lives, and these behaviours happen at supermarkets, at their home, at their office, or their other place of work, at cafes, at restaurants. And so dietary behaviour is actually far more complex than we can typically capture in a food diary. And so now we're going to explore what drives eating behaviour. But keep in mind that as we go through this talk now, when we're talking about eating behaviour, we're kind of talking about everything I've just discussed there, not just the act of eating, but the preparation that's involved. And before we get into the details, I want to put a question to the audience. We're not going to spend too much time on this, maybe just a minute. Think about, what do you think drives eating behavior? And we'll start there before we get into the gritty details of it all. We got a few. No. Okay. Oh, emotions, tiredness, great. Yes. Budget, yes. Price. Food, knowledge, and money. Okay. Cool. Environment. Culture, yes. Okay. Lots of stuff. I'm aware of time, and I want to make sure we get to a space where we can also get questions from you guys. So what I can see in the chat is that you're coming up with a lot, and that's great. Because what I want to illustrate is, again, let's think about complexity. How complex it can really get. You're covering a lot of issues, but I want to show you the systems map to really drive home this point. And do not worry, you do not need to really take in the detail of this. It's purely just a visual. So this was developed the UK government 2007, and it was used to map the factors driving obesity. And it's a powerful visual of just how much can feed into behaviours and also public health outcomes and/or issues that we're interested in as researchers. And if we try and make it a little bit easier to read, we can go to the next slide and break it down, showing that all of these factors, so the little boxes and the arrows showing what they influence or what they cause, can fall into different categories like food production, food consumption, physiology, physical activity environment, because this is for obesity, social psychology and individual psychology. And I think from what I understand, many of you will be familiar with the food production side. What Tess and I are going to focus really on today is the social and individual psychology side of eating behavior. But the key point isn't just that there's all of these factors, it's that they don't always carry equal weight, right? There are thicker lines on this map representing stronger influences on behavior and thinner lines representing weaker links. This is actually called the qualitative causal model, causal loop model, if anyone's interested. And it was originally designed to help policymakers understand the complexity of the issue that they were contending with and narrow in and test possible responses. So the takeaway is that food production for yourselves, if that's where you work or whatever part that you work on, is usually just one piece of a larger puzzle. And when you try and think of the entire puzzle, it's incredibly complex, but sometimes it's important to do to understand where your work might intersect. But I want to draw back and try and simplify this, make a clear and use a clearer framework for understanding the social and individual psychology influencing behavior. And this is the theoretical domains framework. It consolidates about 33 psychological and behavioral theories behind very various behaviors, not only eating. But it's a useful starting point for mapping all of the factors that might shape someone's eating behavior. And at the center in the green circle, we have the COM-B model. And this identifies 3 key drivers of behavior: capability, opportunity, and motivation. And to try and bring these to life, I'm going to think of each of them through Dave's eyes. So capability covers both psychological things like knowledge and physical factors like skills. So does Dave know what a healthy or sustainable diet looks like, not just for himself, but his child and potentially his partner? Physically, can he actually prepare those meals? Does he know how to cook a meal that is nutritionally balanced or that involves more plant-based components? In terms of opportunity, there's 2 dimensions. So we have social opportunity, which is usually around things like social norms, connectedness. So think about, when Dave's eating lunch with his colleagues, what are the norms there? Or do they tend to go out? Do they tend to all bring in pre-prepared food? Do they tend to go to the canteen? Physical opportunity is actually about the external environment around us and what that allows for. So, for example, what's actually available at Dave's canteen for him to eat? What do those options look like? Are those options affordable for him? Are those options healthy? Do they have plant-based food options? And then motivation splits into 2. So we have reflexive motivation. So these are quite deliberate processes. So does Dave have any goals or intentions around a healthy diet or transitioning to more sustainable options? Automatic motivation is kind of things that feel less effortless. We usually tend to talk about these like habits. And this is, Dave choosing under sticking to very similar meals each week, or the same lunch daily, or the same place that he goes to for his lunch. because they seem effortless, doesn't take a lot of thought, mental preparation, and or time to engage in them. But while this is great for kind of simplifying from that very complex diagram we showed you before, this is a framework that was developed for behavior in general, and I think it's really important for us to think about which of these factors are kind of most relevant and how they play out in eating behavior. But like you can see, you kind of covered quite a lot of them in the chat, so that was great. But now I'm going to hand over to Tess, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about what these mean for eating behavior specifically.
Amazing. Thanks, Amy. So when we think about eating motivations, researchers have previously tried to categorize the different determinants of food choice. For example, Renner and colleagues in 2012, they identified 15 subcategories of eating motivations. These were originally developed as a survey that asked people about what they eat and why they eat it. It's not an exhaustive list, but for the purposes of an introduction to consumer dietary behaviour, it's a really useful representation of the major factors at play in people's food choices. So I'm now going to discuss these in a little more detail, but at a higher level. We can think about our food choices being shaped by how our food is marketed, by economic factors, by habits and goals, by social influences, and also by our individual understanding of what counts as healthy and normal eating. So the first set of motivations are related to physiological mechanisms. So traditionally, we've assumed that these are the primary drivers of what and how much people eat. And of course, hunger does matter. But as our understanding has advanced in recent decades, we know that the picture is a little bit more nuanced than that. So hunger at the start of eating isn't usually a good predictor of how much someone will eat. It often signals that eating is likely to begin, but it doesn't determine what someone chooses or how much they are going to consume before stopping. Hunger is also overridden by other factors. For example, you don't need to be hungry to start eating. This is a type of hunger that is referred to as cue-based hunger rather than depletion-based hunger, which is usually when your tummy is rumbling. And you don't need to feel full to stop. Instead, hunger may be a better predictor of a delay to eat than sort of initiation. So if we think about Dave, he gets home from work and he eats dinner with his family, even though he's not necessarily that hungry after a late lunch. Or imagine him at his office desk in the afternoon. Despite him not being hungry, he eats biscuits brought in by a colleague, as many of us do. In both cases, these are cues that are prompting eating, not hunger. So moving on to the next sort of set of mechanisms, we've got, we need to consider dietary components such as palatability. So is the food enjoyable? Is it tasty? Is it a good texture? Is it a nice temperature? And is it visually appealing? So palatability is usually acknowledged as a primary driver of eating, particularly the control of eating, both influencing what we choose and how much we consume. We often eat healthy foods or reject unhealthy foods despite their lower palatability, as there is a perceived trade-off between short-term reward and long-term gain. If we were driven purely by hedonic pleasure, we'd always eat whatever is most palatable and we disregard health considerations entirely. But of course, that's not how people actually behave. And this tells us that other motivations are also at work. So think about Dave. He might know a salad from the canteen is the healthier lunch option and he begrudgingly chooses it. But the hot pasta dish looks and smells far more appealing. We also see palatability play a role in how food becomes less palatable over the course of eating, which is known as sensory-specific satiety. And we often see eating being resumed when a new food is presented. Just think about the elusive pudding stomach that comes out when a waiter gives you a dessert menu. So these are just examples of how palatability can also play a role in initiating and continuing eating. Next up, we have social norms. So another key driver of eating behaviours is social and cultural pressures, which influence what and how much we eat. So social norms act as signals of what's appropriate in a situation based on how others will judge us. So in common social eating scenarios, there are typically three main factors that usually influence our behaviour. These include avoiding overeating, displaying social politeness, and also adhering to the portion sizes of those around you. However, social norms don't always promote restraint necessarily. For example, think about Christmas dinner. We tend to eat far more than we normally do during a regular meal because the norms promote excessive consumption. Food is abundant and overeating is considered acceptable on the 25th of December. This illustrates sort of how social norms can override our typical eating habits. But there are different strengths of motivation, as we've shown. So palatability can override hunger, but social appropriateness can also override both palatability and hunger too. So think about Dave. He's at a work lunch with some clients. The food isn't particularly to his taste or what he likes, but he eats it because everyone else is eating it, and he matches their portion size because the social situation demands it. Another consideration with sort of the social aspects of eating is, do people eat more when eating socially, or do they eat less when they're eating alone? So meals eaten alone are usually perceived as being functional rather than enjoyable, and people report eating faster and choosing more convenient, less tasty food when they're on their own. Indeed, when you're in a familiar group, on the other hand, people will eat and drink more, they will tend to eat a greater variety of foods, they'll spend more time eating, and they'll have greater perceptions of palatability and will choose higher calorie meals. If the basic idea is to eat as much as possible, assuming that the food is palatable, without eating excessively, people will tend to focus on the eater or eaters in the group who eat the most. Basically, if you can manage to eat less than or no more than the other person in the group who eats the most, then you are probably socially safe. Moving on from social norms, you've also got familial and genetic influences at play. So these encapture sort of things like impulsivity and individual psychological traits that affect how we regulate what we eat. And these can vary in their influence from person to person. So once again, back to Dave. He might be someone who finds it very easy to stick to a shopping list, and he's probably, predetermined to resist impulse buys at the supermarket. Then we have got cognitive affective factors, so things like memory, food preferences, and importantly, habits. So sometimes when we say we're hungry, we're not actually hungry, we're just responding to an environmental cue and not necessarily a biological need. For example, when it's lunchtime, we might say we're hungry. It might be more to do with the fact that we eat at the same time at lunchtime every day. So habits are these behaviours that are performed repeatedly in stable contexts, triggered by environmental cues. And they're incredibly efficient, and they save us lots of cognitive resources and time, and they're sort of essentially a very useful shortcut. But that efficiency comes at a cost. So habits can be difficult to control, and this makes behavior change very hard, especially when it comes to eating, when we're performing this behavior at least 3 times a day. Habits were also originally learned because they led to a desired rewarding outcome, which means that they're very deeply reinforced. So think about Dave. Each workday at 12:30, he walks to the same sandwich shop near his office. He's not hungry because he had a mid-morning snack, but he always goes at that time and he's sticking to his normal routine. He orders the same thing, his favorite sandwich, and that saves mental effort. However, if he wanted a healthier lunch, this sort of habitual automaticity could hinder his attempts to change and try something new. It's important to remember that the time and the external environment trigger his habitual behavior. Next up, we have sort of long-term goals, more conscious long-term considerations. These include things like health outcomes. So unlike habits, these involve deliberate decision-making, and they tend to guide behaviors that are performed less frequently or in changing environments, but they can occasionally be a powerful influence. A clear example in recent years is ultra-processed foods. So probably over the last 2 to 3 years, they have become this central topic of discussion in public health, in nutrition, and also in consumer behavior. So many people now cite ultra-processed foods as a major reason that they avoid certain products, and this is driven by media coverage and social media discourse, and that is an example of long-term health motivations actively shaping our food choices. So back to Dave. he's read the headlines, he's heard about ultra-processed foods. When he's now doing the weekly shop, he starts checking labels and he's steering away from certain products he would have bought a couple of years ago without a second thought. On the other hand, when Dave is tired after football training on Friday night, he often defaults to grabbing a Big Mac at McDonald's on the way home. So indeed, when Dave is tired, these old routines fall into place, and he may not even register at that moment that he's eating ultra-processed foods. Therefore, we often see that short-term rewards often override these long-term goals, which makes it particularly difficult to encourage consumers to prioritize health considerations or environmental considerations over, say, something as easily responsive as palatability. Lastly, we have these environmental factors, these external influences, what is around us when we're making these food decisions. So in the survey, Renner and colleagues including convenience and price, but the environmental influences go sort of well beyond that. So these environmental factors include things like pricing and availability. Obviously, you reflected the sort of pricing element in the chat, obviously a very big driver. You've also got things like portion size, accessibility of the food, how it's labelled, the language used to describe it, which was my PhD topic, and then the context in which choices are made, such as habitual settings. So think about Dave. The price of different portions at the cafe on his commute determines what options he can afford. The portion sizes in his work canteen shape how much he eats at lunch. The way a plant-based dish is described on the menu, for example, if the option is labelled as hearty bean chili, as opposed to vegetarian chili, this is going to affect whether he's drawn to it. And none of these factors are Dave's own motivation, but they are the arena that he is entering into when he's making his food decisions, and they're shaping his behaviour from the outside. Another important element to note, in addition to the categories that I've just run through, is individual differences. So we need to consider individual differences, as a person's background can significantly impact their eating behaviour and sort of where they start from when they're making these decisions. So take socioeconomic status. People from lower income backgrounds often face a shortage of cognitive resources due to the demands of their daily lives. And this leads to a reduced engagement with healthy eating. It's not about knowledge, it's about having the skills, equipment, time, and money to invest in healthier practices. You've also got gender differences. So men and women typically face different social expectations and norms around eating, which play out in how they justify their behaviours, for example, such as meat consumption. So lots of research has shown that men tend to be more active in their meat justifications. They frame meat as something that they deserve or that they need. Women, on the other hand, tend to be more passive. They avoid thinking about where their meat comes from rather than actively defending eating it. Culture also matters. So in collectivist cultural contexts, think of countries such as China, India, and Japan. Social influence is a strong predictor of food choices. So how frequently friends and family eat a certain food has a lot more weight than in individualistic cultural contexts, for example, in places like the US, Canada, and the UK. So think about Dave. He fits quite neatly into the demographic that most research captures. He's a working age man, he has a stable income, but if Dave was on a 0 hours contract, or he was a single parent juggling childcare, or he was from a cultural background where family eating norms carried more weight, these factors driving his food choices would look very different. Also, one important caveat before we move on, many of the models, the measures, the data sets, the sort of way that we think about consumer behaviour, it's often better at predicting the behaviour of young, healthy, affluent individuals, particularly men such as Dave. So there is often a significant sort of consideration to be made when we're trying to understand eating behaviour across the whole population and thinking that, it's not as homogenous as we might think it is. So if eating behaviour is this complex with many factors at play, how can we actually go about changing it? So the question to put to you now, if you'd like to use the chat, fingers on your keyboards, what do you think is the best way to changing behaviour? Have you seen strategies that have worked? What was involved? And on the other side of things, what do you think is less effective? So if you could just take a minute to share your thoughts, that would be wonderful. Let's have a look at the chat. Changing the food environment, absolutely. Cash first, yeah, totally. Any other reflections? Practical education, yes, although it might be less effective. Making the healthy option the easiest option, absolutely. More affordable to eat healthier. Yes, perfect, great. Some really useful comments in the chat. In the interest of time, going to move back over to Amy. So Amy, if you would like to take us away with behaviour change models, please.
Yes. So before Tess gets into the specific strategies that are used in this space, we think it's important to step back and think about the behaviour change models, which means like the kind of frameworks that help us understand these kind of cognitive and behavioural processes we're trying to intervene on, and which strategies might work for actually moving the needle. And there has been a significant uptake in behavioural science and policy over recent years. We see the behavioural public policy movement, behavioural insights units emerging across government and institutional settings. I'm part of a leadership hub called Behavioural Research UK, which is all about getting behavioural research used to tackle societal challenges. So I want to start by introducing some of the models that are used in this space to help kind of design interventions, whether it's at the policy level or individual level. So if we go to the next slide, a really useful example, I think, is the behaviour change wheel. This builds directly on the kind of COM-B model and theoretical domains framework we introduced earlier. But rather than just identifying what drives behaviour, it asks, okay, given those drivers, what interventions might we be able to use to change it? So that might mean increasing people's knowledge, improving their capability by building their skills. It might mean shaping their motivation to adopt healthier, sustainable eating habits. It might mean changing the opportunities available to them, which was all kind of the examples you were giving. And to show how this works around this kind of green COM-B model, you'll see a ring of what are called intervention functions. So things like guidelines and training, enablement. And what this means is, for example, let's think about education for capability building and the Eat Well guide that's really quite well known in the UK around what a like nutritionally balanced plate might look like, and or the public like health communication campaign of 5 a day. At least when I was growing up, that was massive, and we could all kind of cite it and understand that that was something that we should be striving for. Opportunity could be intervened on through things like incentivization or restructuring the physical environment. This could be changing what's available in terms of physically and or what is available through things like how much it costs, but also like where it's sitting in the choice environment, which Tess will get onto. Then this outer ring, when we think past those intervention functions, it's thinking about what are the policy categories, so like the policy levers we have at our disposal to actually deliver these intervention functions. And a kind of good example of this would be like fiscal measures, regulations, service provision. So the sugar tax actually is a good example here about changing the physical environment through legislation and fiscal measures. Because it increased the price, and we know from behavioral economics that people are quite incentivized by price. And they did this in both the UK and Mexico as a fiscal lever to shift SSB patterns through pricing. In the UK, it was quite successful. We saw, for example, things like big industry like Irn-Bru in Scotland changing their entire recipe to have less sugar in it. So that changed the environment. Even if people still bought Irn-Bru, they were just at default consuming less sugar. But in Mexico, we saw kind of mixed evidence of this. We see people just kind of not drinking SSBs as much anymore, but not drinking anything. So we have issues with hydration there. Or we have people continuing to drink SSBs anyway, because in that cultural context, it was such a part of social norms around how you welcome people into your home and provide SSBs, or a way of socializing during working days. The key point is just that there are many tools available to us, as Tess will go over in more detail. They each target different drivers in different ways, and we probably can't just pick one of them. And the behavior change wheel gives us a systematic way to match the right intervention to the right driver, or at least understand if we pick a certain intervention, what we're actually able to change. We then have the next model, which shifts the focus back to individual and what stage of change someone's in. So to explain this, I'm going to track Dave deciding around maybe transitioning towards more plant-based, a more plant-based diet. And the key insight is not everyone's ready to change. So in pre-contemplation, Dave wouldn't be thinking about changing anything because he would think that what he's currently doing is fine. In contemplation, maybe he's come across some content, messaging campaigns, maybe educational content around the environmental impact of meat and dairy, and is starting to question his family's diet, but he isn't really committed to changing anything. In preparation, maybe he starts to talk with his partner and actually plan about what a more plant-based diet could look like in their home, what to cook, how to use ingredients that they maybe don't use as much in the UK, like beans and legumes. And then in action, the change actually happens. So that's a lot of steps before we even get to change. But that would be, them actually buying different produce, choosing a plant-based option at the canteen or at the sandwich shop, or cooking like new meals. Then there comes maintenance, and this is where it gets hard because one, we don't have a lot of research that spans a lot of time, so a lot of what we know about behavior change comes from short-term research. And also relapse is common, so especially when rewards are long-term, like Tess said, when we think about health and environmental impact in the moment of our food choices and behavior, these aren't always salient, they don't always win out in driving. And so Dave might sustain it for a few weeks when he's really motivated and feeling a lot about that documentary or that piece of information he was giving, but then default back to similar dinners, similar options as his life. That kind of drops out of saliency and his life is still busy and there's a lot of demands on his time and habits are just easier to engage in. So the model does allow for an upward spiral, right? We can learn from relapse and we can return to action and we can still maintain even if we kind of drop in and out of the perceived pattern that we would like. But these are just some kind of core models that have been used in behavioral research broadly to tackle things like public health issues around smoking, around transitions to systems that don't promote obesity as much. So Tess is going to talk to you a little bit more about what this looks like specifically for food, again, with another model and some key examples.
Sure, thanks, Amy. So in addition to the combi model and the trans-theoretical model of change, which Amy's just gone over, it's also important to consider sort of more grounded theories, such as the grounded cognition theory of desire. So this is a model I've worked with very closely. It's related to this sort of dual process perception, which takes into account automatic processes happening in the background when we make our food choices, alongside these more reflective, conscious choices about our diets in a more generalized way. So think more about like memory and association and what these mean for our eating behavior. So the central concept of grounded cognition theory of desire revolves around instances of what are called situated conceptualizations. These are basically food memories. And details from previous eating experiences are encoded in our memory, and they can be reactivated later by a range of different cues. So when triggered, the person partially re-experiences that earlier eating episode, and if it was a really positive eating episode, it increases their desire to repeat it. That's where the desire element comes into this. And this mechanism can account for a wide range of influences on our food choices, from social norms to habits. So to give you a concrete example of how this might come about. So imagine Dave, he's eating pork ribs at a summer family barbecue. His memory encodes the whole experience. So eating with his hands, being outside in the garden, the sweet glaze, the condiments on the table, particular relatives being around him, the smell of barbecue smoke, to name a few. Weeks later, Dave sees sticky pork ribs on a restaurant menu. That language cue partially reactivates his memory at the summer family barbecue, and he infers what it would be like to eat them right now, anticipates it will be rewarding, and then orders the ribs, or he picks them up at a supermarket to have a barbecue at the weekend. So this matters for behavior change because there are these processes that operate beneath our sort of conscious intention. So Dave might have planned to eat more plant-based meals that weekend, but a single cue can trigger a powerful food memory that pulls him back towards familiar choices. We also, bearing all of this in mind, we also need to confront an uncomfortable reality that individual behavior change is very difficult. So people might have the best of intentions to change their eating behavior, but those intentions often have a limited effect on what actually happens. So this is what is known as the intention behavior gap. So Webb and Sheeran analysed 47 intervention experiments, and they found that interventions such as messaging and guidance shifted people's eating intentions, so what they wanted to do, but it had a much smaller effect on their actual behaviour. And the intention behavior gap tends to be wider in three particular situations. So the first is when people's sense of control over their behavior is low. The second is when circumstances support this habit formation, so making older patterns harder to break. And the third is when social norms in a particular eating context override these personal intentions. So once again, let's go back to Dave. He genuinely intends to eat more plant-based meals, but at the work canteen, all his colleagues are ordering the usual options and the plant-based options feel expensive for what it is. And at home on a busy Wednesday evening, he defaults to the familiar pasta dish the family always has because the habit is strong when he's tired. So Dave's intentions haven't changed. He still wants to eat more plant-based meals, but the gap between what he wants to do and what he ends up doing remains wide. So one powerful way to address this and to address the issue that behaviour change is difficult is through interventions that can change the environments consumers make decisions in. And this takes a lot of the heavy lifting off the consumer. So strategies like pricing, labelling and availability are less effortful for the consumer, although not necessarily less effortful for the food service industry to implement. So there are sort of trade-offs that we need to consider here. They don't require the same level of motivation on a consumer level, although some motivation to choose a healthier or more sustainable option might still be needed. They can reach more consumers because they can be rolled out across sort of similar settings, you know, think locally, nationally or globally. And they're typically easier to maintain because it's not down to the individual actively repeating a behaviour to form a habit. If the environment changes, then people tend to follow suit. So when we are thinking about changing choice environments, the strategies are often referred to as nudges, which you might have heard of before. These are changes to choice architecture that make the right choice, quote unquote, the default or easier choice to choose. So for example, making sustainable foods the default option in food service settings, placing healthy items in prominent positions on menus, making unhealthy buffet items harder to reach, or putting healthy snacks at the checkout are all examples of nudges, which you might have seen from your own anecdotal experiences in food environments. So these nudges can be rolled out at a scale across many different settings, and when choice environments shift successfully, this impacts industry behaviour as well. So industry will then adjust what they offer and they will advertise based on what the consumers are choosing because they're driven by profit. So changing the environment can create this important ripple effect. However, these nudges don't always work. So think about Dave at his work canteen. If the plant-based meals are placed first and second in line, they might be enough to sway him on a day when he's not really fussed about what he eats. But on a day when he really, really wants the steak fajitas, he will walk straight past those sort of plant-based meals at the first and second point of the line. So the nudge hasn't changed his motivation. And basically, when the motivation for the steak fajitas is strong enough, he will expend the extra effort to find what he wants. So nudges can change the opportunity, but they are only part of the picture. So in recent years, there have been some important industry-focused resources that have been developed to help facilitate these environmental shifts, such as the World Resource Institute's playbook on promoting plant-based dishes in food purchase environments. So this was developed to give food service operators practical guidance for creating dining environments that empower consumers to choose sustainable plant-rich dishes. So it covers 5 target areas. The first is product. So this is about modifying the food being served. And they show an example. So Garnett and colleagues in 2019 found that simply doubling the number of vegetarian options in a cafeteria increased sales by 70%. So this is a powerful example of choice architecture shifting behaviour. The second target area is placement, so how the food is displayed and how the physical environment is set up. So for example, one study found that priming diners with cultural signals, even like playing music from Mexican artists, predicted food choice, and it drove more orders of the Mexican dish. So even something as simple as background music can shape what people choose. You've then got presentation, so modifying the language, the imagery, the layout of menus, signs, etc. So Bacon and colleagues in 2018 found that people were less likely to choose a vegetarian option when it was placed in a separate vegetarian section on the menu, because it was seen as this different, lesser and abnormal choice. So please don't put vegetarian options in a box. Promotion. So this is related to communication, marketing, advertising. So even something as simple as providing free samples of a plant-based dish at a restaurant can increase sales by 8.5%. And giving people the opportunity to try the food really has an effect on future choices. The last target area is people. So these are techniques targeting food service employees. This includes things like plant-rich recipe competitions, giving chefs the time and space to develop plant-based dishes and rewarding them for doing so. So if the staff are on board with plant-based food, that translates to the consumer experience. So, you know, there are these initiatives, there are these documents coming out to really sort of help promote plant-based dishes in sort of choice environments. But we need to understand that, you know, one technique isn't going to work and change everything. You need sort of a range of techniques, a range of strategies. You need to consider the whole picture. So I'm now going to pass you back to Amy, who's going to run you through our call to action. So Amy, over to you.
Yeah, so I'll keep this really brief. I'm aware of time, but we've covered a lot, so we just kind of wanted to leave you with something to take away and sit with. So if you think about the kind of problem in the food system that you're currently working on, whether that's healthy transition, sustainable diets, culture, heritage, are there aspects of complexity across how you're defining behavior, what's determining it, how we might change that you haven't fully considered? And that's kind of a question to take away with for yourself. Obviously cannot be answered in this question, but also kind of how these models might fit in with your work. And there's a couple of kind of questions. There's 3 that we thought that might help consider this broader question. So the first is, what are you actually trying to change? You know, the main goal might be actually how people eat, but you might need to be shifting preparation behaviors that come before that. What is the context that people are in when they're performing this behavior? And third, what is the kind of internal and external factors that you might be trying to tackle with your interventions? Behavioral science, if we just go to the final slide, I think can be a part of how we transform food systems. It's one of many parts that we need. But I think the key tension that we want to address is that we often tend to simplify in order to act, especially in like behavioral public policy, and that's necessary. We can't always keep space for the massive obesity systems map when designing solutions, and we need to focus in on certain aspects. That's fine. But I think we do need to keep checking back to more complex models or in with other disciplines to understand, have we simplified too much? Have we focused too heavily on the environment, forgetting individual agency? And one kind of key message to drive this home is that every person that is in a restaurant or at home or in places where we buy food, like supermarkets, has a very complex life, just like Dave. And so the issues that we're working on aren't always as simple as we make them.